Good evening. I'm C.L. Bohannon. I'm the Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and it's my honor to welcome you to Languages of Invisibility, Devaluation, and Triumph, a powerful exploration of cultural memory, representation, and resilience. This event is supported by the Dean's Forum on Equity and Inclusion, UVA's Center for Cultural Landscapes with support from the Mellon Foundation and the Sarah Schallenberger Brown Endowment. Tonight's event brings together two incredible voices, Veronica Jackson and Dr. Andrea Douglas, in conversation with our own Dr. Andrea Roberts. Through this dialogue, Jackson and Douglas will examine the often overlooked narratives embedded in our landscapes and built environments, challenging how we perceive, value, and honor spaces shaped by cultural histories, particularly those impacted by devaluation and erasure. Their work invites us to confront these languages of invisibility and to reconsider how we recognize and celebrate the resilience embedded in place and in communities. Tonight's conversation will not only deepen our understanding of these landscapes, but will also inspire us to design and plan, but will also inspire us to see design and planning as fields where narratives of triumph and resistance can find visibility and resonance. I will now take a few moments to introduce our guests. Dr. Andrea Douglas holds an MA and PhD in art history from the University of Virginia and an MBA in arts management and finance from Binghamton University. From 2004 to 2010, she was a curator of collections and exhibitions and curator of contemporary art at the University of Virginia Art Museum. She is also the co-chair of the President's Commission on the Age of Segregation at the University of Virginia and sits on Monticello's Advisory Committee on African American Affairs, as well as the state's history of lynching in Virginia working group. She has served on the City of Charlottesville Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Monuments, and Public Spaces, the University of Virginia's President's Commission on Slavery at the university, and was the chair of the city's Place Design Task Force. Veronica Jackson critically examines the various disciplines of visual culture, art, architecture, and design. As an artist, she records, interprets, and makes aware the complexities in which humans exist and affect their social surroundings. As an architect and interpretive designer, she creatively engages in projects related to structural systems within virtual and built environments. Her visual art practice is a combination of past professional disciplines, present lived experiences, and an accumulation of contemporary and historic research. Jackson's multidisciplinary body of work is text-based, autobiographical, and responds to her gendered and racialized existence in America. Her socially conscious practice investigates Black women's visibility, value, and devaluation in visual culture while focusing on the portrayal, perception, and legacy of Black women in popular media. Jackson holds an MA in Visual and Critical Studies from CCA, San Francisco, and a BS in Architecture from UVA. I will now invite Veronica to come to the stage to kick us off. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing out here? Thank you to my fans that are out there. Yes. So, a couple of things. You will notice that this is a different title than what it was advertised. That's because artists always change things. Second thing is, I usually start these lectures by giving a little add-on to the introduction. I am an architect by training from UVA Architecture School many, many decades ago. I am an interpretive designer and exhibit designer by somewhat profession. I've been doing this for about 40 plus years. And I am now a visual artist by profession. So I'm like semi-retired from exhibit design, but I still got to eat, right? So at the same time, I think I've always been a visual artist. It just took some time to come out. So I say that to say that there are multi-layers to me as a person. There's multi-layers to this story I'm getting ready to tell you. So hope you enjoy the ride. So Recasting and Reclaiming Untold Narratives is a title that Andrea Douglas and I had a conversation, and it came about, this new title, because it speaks to, and I speak in context, it speaks to my work that does also speak to languages of invisibility, devaluation, and triumph. And the visuals hopefully will make sense. So monumentalizing untold stories. And what I mean by that literally is making monuments out of these untold stories, which is the Black experience for me in America, but also Black women in America. And at the same time, these untold, unrecognized stories that I have uncovered through my work in the archives. And that's the exhibit designer in me. That's also the architect in me, in the sense of like doing research, mining, excavating, right? So let's look at the definition of monument. Monument Lab is a design studio based in Philadelphia. They define monument as a statement of power and presence in public. I believe I wanted to add, once again, architects and artists changing things. I think it's important to add that other word to it, a statement of power, presence, and purpose in public. And that is what I do with my work. So Blacktivists or Black activists. Blacktivists is a series of work that is outside in the East Gallery Hall. And it is a series of work that speaks to Black activists. There are 13 Black women activists that I found from the Library of Congress who no one knows about. And once again, it's mining the archive. It's excavating this information. One of these activists is Anna Julia Cooper. And I show this to once again put things in context. The thing about Anna Julia Cooper, many people don't know that she is the only woman that has a quote in every U.S. passport. She was born in 1856, and she died in 1964. She was 105 years old when she died. She was this amazing scholar and activist. What I found with these 13 women, despite their various professions, architect, one was an architect who was out there in the hallway, education, teachers, no lawyers or doctors, because at the time when they were born in the 1850s, these were not professions that were availed to Black women. But despite all of the other elements that in their being, they were all activists, every one of them. And so that's why I gathered these women together and created this Blacktivist series. So I'm showing you this image, and then I focused in on creating portraits of these 13 activists. I wanted to hone in on their faces, create these portraits of them, and they are a little bit larger than life size, right? So we can get the experience of them. I show you, this is the image in white, but then I created these portraits with Black ink on Black paper because I'm speaking to the Black women's invisibility by silk screening them with Black ink. So they're barely legible, barely readable, just like their stories, barely there, unless you do the work to uncover and discover who these women are. Then I added an extra fine layer of glitter to talk about reflectivity, to highlight, to enhance their visibility. For so long, it had been invisible. Hackley and Brooks. So the woman on the right is Elizabeth Carter Brooks. She was an architect, born in the 1850s. And once again, looking at the Black on Black with glitter, highlighting their reflectivity. Each of these pieces were portraits that I created. I added that kind of like arched element at the top by debossing the paper and then silk screening on top of it. So my work is very multi-layered, very process oriented. And this is the Blacktivists with glitter in series in an installation in California. And this is an installation that I just had in Richmond at Visual Arts Center in Richmond that closed about 2 weeks ago. So the whole element of these 13 women, there are 12 portraits. One portrait has 2 people, so that's why it's 13 women. Each of the portraits has a letter and it spells out the word Blacktivist. So if you've noticed the plaques underneath each person out in the hallway, if you notice that there's a letter at the top of each plaque, that spells out Blacktivists. Part of the work that I'm doing as a visual artist that does stand on the shoulders of my exhibit design career, of my architecture training, is looking at materiality. So this series of Blacktivists has many iterations. The first one was the black paper, black ink on black paper with black glitter. This new iteration that I've done at a residency in Richmond was to start looking at different materials. So this is black stained birch veneer plywood that I silk screened these images onto this black plywood, added the glitter. And then here's another series, another look at materiality. And this is bullseye glass that is fused. So what I have done with this is taking silk screening glass frit, glass powder, silk screening it onto a glass sheet, and then baking it in a kiln. So very process oriented is my work, very physical, but it's this element of process, it's this element of invisibility that I'm now making visible with this work in this series in glass. So this is Anna Julia Cooper, once again in glass, and this is Hackley and Brooks. And there is an example of those two pieces out in the hallway. So memorializing embedded stories in the landscape. And with this, I'm really looking at these stories that have been buried or covered up. Once again, unknown, untold stories. Tree Bands is a piece that I did for the Flow Art Festival that Chroma Gallery here in Charlottesville used to do. Hopefully that will start up again. And it's an outdoor festival, one-day festival, sometimes 2 days, along the Rivanna River. So Tree Bands is a memorial, once again, to undiscovered labor, undiscovered stories. I researched Thomas Jefferson's farm book, which is a book where he cataloged all of his supplies, including his enslaved people, in a manifest, just like he would name them along with his chattel. And in this farm book, I found the names of these 7 enslaved people who did the work, and it was listed as a roster. I embroidered the names of these 7 people along with their birth and death dates and their job onto these bands. And I call them tree bands because then I wrapped them around trees along the Rivanna River, because the Rivanna River is also known as Jefferson's River. And so it was this whole element of the goods and the work that these people did along that would float down the Rivanna River to town. And so along these trees, along this grove of trees, we have several bands that are wrapped around the trees. What's also very fascinating about this piece is that you start to really realize the breadth, depth, and history of enslavement, right? 1743. You know, it's not just something from the 1800s. And then this is a perspective of the armbands or the tree bands in the grove along the Rivanna River. And then atoning devalued labor. And so an atonement is another form of memorializing or monumentalizing, right? So atoning is giving that message back, and that devalued labor in this sense speaks to my grandmother's devalued labor. So That's Pops' Money is a project that I did in homage of my grandmother. And to give you a little background, my mother was having a discussion with my uncle one day, and my mother made reference to Mama's money, speaking about my grandmother's money that she was getting as a pension from my grandfather's death. And my uncle disrespectfully said, "Oh, that's not Mama's money, that's Pops' money." Meaning that the money that my grandmother was receiving was not her money, that she did not earn that she did not work for that, but that's my grandfather's money. And those 3 words sparked a project. I went and I interviewed, once again, mining the archive. I interviewed my mother and my aunts. And I said, what did grandma do inside the home? Because it was very important. My mother taught me this when I was 12 years old, that work inside the home is work. So with this time card, it spells out the type of things that my grandmother did inside the home as labor. So, clean the house, wash the clothes, attended church. My grandmother had 9 children, so wifely duties is also listed there. So I created these time cards, 1 card for each of the 12 months. And then I letterpress printed 804 time cards through a Vandercook press here at Virginia Center for the Book. Each card represents 1 month of the 67 years that my grandmother was married to my grandfather and labored inside the home. So these cards are laid out on 12 wall panels that are 4 feet wide by 8 feet tall, and they encompass a room. They are printed with black ink or blue ink on black paper. The blue ink speaks to my grandmother's blue collar labor. And it's interesting that this blue ink on black paper renders itself red when photographed. And these time cards are embedded or embossed into the black paper. So you can literally feel my grandmother's labor. You can see how it's embedded into the paper. There are 9 date cards. So it starts at 1939, the year of my grandparents' marriage, and ends in 2006, the date of my grandfather's death. And so this breadth of time cards of labor is scattered throughout or ordered throughout the room. I was brought up in a very misogynistic family. My grandfather definitely valued the boys over the girls. So on the birth date of the 5 boys, their names are foil stamped in white so that they are highly legible, readily readable. And on the birth date of the 4 girls, their names are foil stamped in black because their essence was barely legible. In fact, all 5 boys came home from the hospital with 3 names. 2 of my aunts came home from the hospital with baby girl Jefferson on their birth certificate. So That's Pops' Money has been shown here in Charlottesville at Chroma Gallery, Vault, Virginia. And in this iteration, couldn't fit all 12 wall panels within the space. So I did 10 paper panels, and then the remainder of the pieces were stacked into this kind of like this pedestal, this vitrine in the middle of the space so that you could see the thickness, right, of that labor. Here's another iteration of this. And in some ways, this is a monument, right, to my grandmother's labor. This is a statement of power and presence and purpose in public. I'm showing this just like the various iterations of this work and how it encompasses a room. And this is the last time I've installed it, which is in Richmond at Visual Arts Center. This gives you a sense of the scale of the piece. And I think that if I did not study architecture, I would not be able to perceive or create a work like this, very 3-dimensional. So my architecture degree has helped me think 3-dimensionally as a visual artist. And I want to end on this time card again, because I want to, for students out there, and you're thinking about your work as architects, maybe you're thinking about becoming a visual artist. I mean, maybe I could get some converts out of this room. Thinking about the layering of information, and my work is multi-layered. So I wanted to leave you with 3 things. Jefferson is not the real name of my grandparents. Because of identity theft and things like that, I just used a fake name. But their name is 3 syllables and is the last name of a president who did enslave people. So you can think about what that name could be. But my grandfather's real name was Thomas. So Jefferson made sense to be the actual last name, since he kind of treated my grandmother like she was enslaved. Secondly, the work, my grandmother was very religious. So on these time cards, every 7th day, you will see attended church. And then finally, Bet or Betta is a play off the word Bet. Bet was one of those enslaved workers in Jefferson's farm book that I had embroidered her name. And so I added the A to make it better because my grandmother was definitely the better Jefferson. And I want to end on monument to set it up and tee it up for Andrea. A statement of power and presence and purpose in public is what we're talking about with our two different forms of work. But at the same time, it is this purpose that I want to focus in on. It's like we're purposely making this work. We're purposely making, whether it's visual art or architecture in the built environment. Let's think about the purpose that we do as cultural producers. Thank you.
Hello, all. I'm a walker and a talker. This stuff is intimidating to me, so I'll do most of my stuff out here. So that means I have to turn on my mic. Okay, you can hear me, yes? Perfect. Okay. So yes, my name is Andrea Douglas, and I run the African American Heritage Center in Charlottesville. Hopefully some of you have been there. If not, down Main Street, hang this hand when you get to 4th Street, Northwest. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is a project that we have been working on for quite a while, called Swords Into Plowshares. And I'm specifically talking about the second phase of Swords Into Plowshares, which serendipitously we called Recast and Reclaim. And so somehow within the conversations that Veronica described for us, this has come to be a kind of interesting set of mnemonics that we can talk about. I wanted to just do one of the things that I do when I talk is I realize there are a lot of people in this room who don't know what happened in 2017, that you all were like 13, and we go on and on and on about what happened as if it was, immediate and everyday activity, when for some of you it's already become historicized. Like this is something that happened at some point, not so much in the far distance, but certainly in a space that is somewhat separate and apart from where we sit today. And so just to give you a sense of the things that are part of this conversation, and certainly I'm not going to be dwelling on this because, as I said, I'm interested in moving forward. We're into this second phase. But of the monuments that were removed, we're talking about the Johnny Reb that used to live in Court Square. We're talking about the George Rogers Clark that used to live over here at the university. The Jackson statue also in Court Square. And then this is the Lee statue that came down, and this is the Lewis and Clark statue. And of all the statues in Charlottesville, what actually still remains is this statue here from 1893, and that's actually at the university still, right? And why this one, in some respects, is not one that had been considered is because it did what it was supposed to do. If you go to the cemetery that is at Alderman and you go up to that statue, what you see on the sides of it are the actual names of those soldiers who went to the university who died. And so it does act in the way that it is as a memorial, where these other ones are doing something quite different. So now we'll move on. Just to contextualize you, because the question that we have to contend with as we were thinking about Swords Into Plowshares, and let me say to you that Swords Into Plowshares came into being because the Heritage Center applied to acquire the Robert E. Lee statue. We were given that statue by the city of Charlottesville and given it with the full intent that we were going to melt it down. And our intent in doing that is not to be vindictive, as we have been accused of over and over, as a matter of fact, 3 days ago even, but it was to create some material for something else, to transform this material. Swords Into Plowshares actually comes from a quote from the Bible. It's from Isaiah 24. And what that says is, I always have to read this My colleague, Jelaine Schmidt, who I started with, she's the religious studies professor. I'm the atheist, sometimes agnostic, sometimes I've read the Bible because I had to write a Renaissance art paper, right? We're art historians. We read the Bible for different reasons, right? So swords into plowshares. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. No nation shall not lift swords against nation. Rather shall they learn, neither shall they learn war anymore. I should write more clearly. So anyway, so the point of that is that there is in that this sort of sense of purpose. Why would we do that? And it is sort of a way of us addressing a moment of trauma and trying to move beyond that trauma into a different process. But one of the things that becomes interesting to me as I begin to sort of lead this community into this next phase of the conversation was, what is the relevance of taking down these objects if within our landscape we still live with articulations of ideologies, right? Veronica showed you a definition offered by the Monument Lab about monuments, but to expand that definition, we understand that monuments carry ideology and that they're developed in relationship to bodies, right? They're not just ideological objects. We, all of us who think about place and space, understand that place and space is created in relationship to human bodies, right? And so in that way, there is a humanity and ideology. And so I began to ask the question, where in it were we still seeing a continuation of conversations around a kind of ideology in our public spaces, right? For me, places like Lane High School. Lane High School opened in 1938, ultimately closed in the early 70s. But when it was opened, it replaced an African-American art community known as Pearl Street. Pearl Street was a middle-class community that it was essentially raised so they could build Lane High School. And by the time they built Lane High School, the person who was the superintendent in Charlottesville had already built several schools. He had built Venable School, he had built Clark School, and then he built Lane's. And a Venable School, he said, I'm going to build a school that is going to allow the ideology of the university to trickle down into the community. Right? And so it has its neoclassical porticos. And all of you who are on 14th Street, you've passed by it. You know what it looks like. You walk up a grand staircase into some columns. And then if you've gone to school there, you understand that you walk almost into its auditorium. Right? Very rotunda-esque. Similarly, Clark School, 1934. When he's building Clark School, so he goes so much deeper into the details of it that he's talking about where the windows are going to go in the bathrooms. And he wants to make sure that little cherubs, even in the bathroom, are bathed in the sunlight, right? And then ultimately Lane. All of these places are still in use. 2 of them as schools and 1 of them as the county office building, right? So that's an interesting thing for me as we begin to ask the questions. What is it that we are speaking to? And can we, in fact, create an object that exists as antithetical to the very ideologies that those objects in 1924, when the final ones were placed, speak to? I was reading Elizabeth Alexander's The Trayvon Generation 2022, small book, really easy to read, fast read if you haven't read it. As with so many sites and communities, the future is a blank slate and an open door. Art and history are indelibles. They outlive flesh. They offer us a compass or a lantern with which to move through the wilderness and allow us to imagine something different and better. It feels heavy. It feels big. It feels aspirational. Swords into Plowshares, we hope, can in some way create something that is a democratic process that reaches this in some form. But how does one actually acquire and are able to do this? Got to look at the other monuments that have been built, because we have been building monuments here, right? This is the Catherine Foster Monument. How many people know that monument? Yay. And all of you who don't know that monument, it is over at South Lawn. It is built by one of the most important African-American architects in our country. Internationally, the fact that it is at your university and you don't know where it is, I've got nothing else to say to you on that. But pilgrimage is part of monument memorialization. Take a pilgrimage. They've made it easy for you to get over there, right? But basically, Catherine Foster was a free Black woman who owned property here at the university. And what he has done is created a shadow building of her home. And then also part of that landscape are the actual graves from that family. In fact, as I think about this, this is the only monument that I would argue at this moment is a monument to freedom that exists in this community, right? Free Black woman. Virginia changes the lineage from the patrilineal line to the matrilineal line so that they can continue or create or develop the industry of enslavement. Catherine Foster is a free Black woman who is able to pass her homestead down through her family, through her matrilineal line. But that site's very important for other reasons. I'll keep going. This, do you know where Burley High School is, or Burley Middle School? Have you seen this? This is right out in front. This is the only monument that has been actually created by Black people in this town. This is the monument that was created by those people who went to Burley High School. And on that monument are the names of all of those people who could afford to do it, are the names of those people. What it commemorates, though, is Jackson P. Burley himself. Jackson P. Burley was a businessman. In order to build this, what would become the Black High School in 1951, his wife, through eminent domain, through sale, loses 48 acres of property to build the Black High School. But this is the only Black monument made by Black people. This is the monument to enslaved laborers. What I'm about to say, first let me say, I was 5 minutes already? Wow. All right, we'll speed it up, but it's okay. This is the monument to enslaved laborers. This is Monticello's monument that just opened 2 years ago, last summer. And then there's the other monuments that we've built since 2017. These are all the monuments on our buildings from the mural project, right? And they sort of create a narrative about Charlottesville. These are some other murals that have been placed on our buildings since. These are 2019, since 2019. And then we have to ask a question, another set of questions. Because what I am interested in talking about these monuments is talking about this idea of the realm of the public. These objects exist in the public, they're public spaces. Charlottesville was recently named one of the 5th happiest places as a consequence of the proximity to parks, right? 84% of us live within a walking distance to parks, which also caused me to sort of think about some other things. This is the 1926 description of Charlottesville from the Chamber of Commerce. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, thus protected from severe cold in the winter and heat in the summer, lies Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a garden spot of beauty where nature has been lavish in the distribution of golden sunshine, crystal waters, towering trees, enchanting hills, and an atmosphere as rejuvenating as the nectar of the gods. Right? This was from 2019. As we were all sort of coming out of what happened in 2017, someone thought it was a good idea to get a company, an advertising company, to create a set of ads about civilization. And, you know, this sort of similarity, juxtaposition between the description in 1926 and this notion of civilization struck me. Do you know what happened in Virginia in 1926? I'll tell you. It was the development of something called the Public Assemblage Act. And that is what the thing that made it illegal for blacks and whites to occupy public space. And so that is the other things that we're thinking about as we're thinking about what's happening with Swords Into Plowshares. 1926, when Paul Goodloe McIntyre purchases McIntyre Park, he also purchases Belmont Park, and he also purchases Washington Park, right? At that very moment that he is ostensibly creating our park system, the Public Exclusion Act becomes law. So obviously what that means is black people don't have access to those parks. Those very parks that were once dotted with monuments. And so the question for me becomes, how do you create an object? How do you understand a landscape? How do you describe a landscape? Most of Charlottesville, this is the map from 1860 of Charlottesville, Albemarle County. What it does, it shows all of the plantations. This is a blow-up of that map with Charlottesville in the middle. Charlottesville's parks, moving forward, are extensively created out of plantation property, right? Next, these are the parks. And these are from our Mapping Seaville project. That's the Covenant map. And so those parks are situated in relationship to white residency. All right? See where I'm going? This is the African American community in Charlottesville. That green spot there is Washington Park. 1926, the African American community would gain Washington Park. It doesn't get another park until the 1950s, Tonsler. These are our parks. These are the things that in the Outsider magazine are the things that very much say that we are an equitable and happy place to live because of the proximity of parks. And so the question that Swords Into Plowshares wants to address is, number one, can we re-articulate this notion of space? Can we think about that as a cultural narrative? We have, to this point, done a survey. We've asked people, where do you want a new object to go? What is that object supposed to do? We understand that we'd like to see a democratic process. But what does it mean when you begin to start to layer those ideals and the ideals that we started with the very fact of the landscape? How is it possible to create an object that will do just what we hope it to do, that will articulate today's cultural value? That's where we are in our conversation today. And so we look to the artists. We look to people like Veronica, right? We look to the artists so that they can think about what these radical solutions would look like. That together with our community, that we can create a community engaged process that brings us to that place where we are defining for ourselves what our cultural space and cultural landscapes look like for our community. Thank you.
Hello. That was amazing. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank both of you for that. And I want to go back to as someone actually raised as a Christian and all of that. I want to go back to that Bible verse only for the reason that it illuminates to me what's so powerful about both your work is it is very much in the spirit of that verse, in the ways that older African Americans used to interpret it. They would say, study war no more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in both of your work, what's so clear is the admonition to study war no more, whether it be in the home, whether it be in the streets. But I also want to give you both an opportunity to speak to this issue of invisibility, legibility, a forced confrontation, and want to ask both of you to talk about what absences and what invisibilities you hope to continue to force people to confront in your work. And we can start with.
Oh, I think that's at the core of it, honestly, because one of the things that when we first began to think about those objects, there's a lot of discussion. I mean, I'm talking about the Confederate monuments and such, right? There was a lot of discussion about that being a modern moment, right? And seeing it in some ways as a singularity. And that did not allow us ultimately to understand that this is both a moment of past and present together. And so grounding it, first of all, in this narrative of enslavement, we live with that every day, right? If you go into Belmont Park, you're not just going into Belmont Park, you're going into the landscape of Belmonte, right? That was the name of the home that was there. But beyond that, beyond the 1926 moment, Belmont was the working class neighborhood. And so articulated and described, there are Black people in this community today who have never been to Belmont because they knew it was a dangerous place to live. And so as you start to chart then that moment from the 1920s, 1924, specifically with the Lee statue, it allows you to go both backwards and forward in time. But it also then inculcates several different kinds of histories, right? We can place a Black body onto that Belmont landscape because of the nature of enslavement, right? We can speak about Jim Crow in that landscape because of the nature of that moment in 1926 when it makes it where it becomes an exclusive space, not available for Black people, right? And so the visible and the invisible in that landscape lives there every single day. It's just what you know or what you don't know, right? But there are people who walk around here whose point of reference for that place, both local and personal, and then expansive to even the conversation about what does it mean to be in public space, who has the right to do that. So I think that's how all of that works for me.
And if you could say something about all of that in light of the fact that you are an artist forcing confrontations so beautifully and mindfully.
About invisibility?
Yes.
Hello? Try again.
Okay.
Turn on?
Yes.
Okay. So tell me the question again.
Sure. We're talking about what is it that you as an artist are forcing people to confront? What do you hope to force people to confront? We are involuntarily confronting in the landscape so much that you've illuminated through that history. Mm-hmm. And what is it that that you're hoping for us to be forced to confront?
Right. I am hoping that we can look at the more personal level, right? And so when I do this work in the archive, I am unearthing this information that I wasn't taught in school. So the BLACKTIVISTS, as an example, or that the farm book exists. So it's all this element about these things about African American history and American history, right? That we aren't taught as Americans that still affect us to this day. So we look at like the 1619 Project, where Hannah Nicole Jones is talking about like the birthplace of racism is enslavement. there are many people in this country who can really not tell you what the Civil War was really about, right?
Right.
So it's like this whole kind of history that we need to get back to, and that's to understand where we are today with race in this country. So, I mean, that's a really kind of broad element, but I want to get back to the foundations that can make us more informed as Americans, as human beings. As Vice President Harris has said, we are more alike than we are different, right? So it's these elements of educating the public about the foundation of this nation is one of my big pieces. That then leads to, like, it's a big jump, but somewhat it's like Reconstruction also, right? And re-evaluating, re-looking at Reconstruction and why it failed so miserably and why we have race relations in this country today that we do.
What strikes me, it makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, it makes a lot of sense. What also strikes me is how much this work requires labor.
Yeah.
This work of the mind, this work of the body, this work of the inquiry and the archive is labor, a lot of labor. And so much of the labor, as you said, we're kind of inculcated with a certain type of perception of Black labor, which is slavery. And I wonder, what are the other stories of labor that you are hoping to monumentalize through all of the work that you do?
That's a really.
I mean,
We
I can
talked
take it.
about this, though.
I know we talked
this a
about
lot.
it. I know we talk about it all the time. I mean, I think that, one of the places that we even think about this, when I'm looking at these other monuments, and as you say, I'm thinking about labor. I think many of these monuments are monuments to labor. They're not monuments to play, right? They're not monuments to a kind of realization of or actualization of the notion of freedom and the being in the world, right? And so for me, what I'm most interested in is, can we define for ourselves even that very place of play? And going back to Veronica, it is the very thing that makes us that defines kind of citizenship, right? The ability to play, the ability to be in the street, the ability to do all of those things. So that certainly we're interested in labor, but what is the other side of labor? And the other side of labor is play. And what I'm interested in doing is also sort of lifting up that place, but not lifting it up as a place. The reason why we think about those parks is because that's where leisure occurs. That's where play occurs. But in the landscape, that's not what was happening in its origin story of that particular place. So where do we find an opportunity for that balance, and how do we articulate that balance? So certainly that would be the work of it, because it's not something that I can do by myself. It's something that I have to ask all of you all to do with me. So that's the other piece of labor. There's a place where all of you have to come to that understanding. I sometimes am afraid to have that conversation because people have said, why can't you just leave it there? Why can't we just play? Why does it have to be laboriously discussed? And the reason why you can't is because it's about public. It's about your place in the environment and in the world.
For me, I would go back to the personal element of, like, understanding women's work, right? And understanding how much devalued labor that women have done, still do, unequal, like doing the same work and not getting paid the same amount of money, but also devalued labor within the home, inside the home, outside the home. And that's where that atonement comes in, because you talked about, like, labor not being acknowledged, and I'm atoning for that labor not being acknowledged in, like, the piece about my grandmother. I'm atoning for the work that I do as an artist that is work. A friend of mine in the audience and I have this conversation that artwork is work, right? Making this work is laborious. And so understanding that making these projects, coming up with these projects, it is a heartrending task sometimes. It weighs on my psyche because I am constantly trying to bring to light these issues with race and gender. So for me, the thing to bring to light is that these elements exist, and it's something that needs to be acknowledged by the public so that we can then start having conversations.
And you were trained as an architect, so you'd be uniquely poised to be specific about what it is about your inquiry, your practice, what it is about either of your practices and ways of inquiry that you especially think are important for preservationists and for planners and for architects to really tap into. What is it that they are missing in terms of your approach, your methodology, and the kind of absences you're able to observe that maybe they aren't?
So what's the question?
The question is, the question is, what is it about the arts, especially, that our preservationists, our planners, our designers, when they're thinking about their various projects and they're asked to work on any given public space? Let's talk more about the public realm, not just monuments, but the public realm. Sure. What is it about the artist sensibility or lens that you think they are missing or need?
I think that they're missing how people use the space, right? And so we need to look at the individuals who have access to the space or not have access to the space and how they are using it. In my exhibit design profession, part of the large amount of work I did for the Smithsonian was about, okay, who is coming to these museums? How are these people accessing this information? And as a designer, I was constantly thinking about accessibility, and not just physical accessibility, right? But also learning styles, learning levels, and things like that. So as designers, think about who is using the space that you're creating.
Yeah. And I agree with all of that. And just to maybe turn it just a little bit even, because we're thinking about ourselves today, but we're really designing for the future, right? And we're asking ourselves about our values today. And the question is, can you look into the further beyond that to ask yourself, can you create something that will hold beyond this particular moment, right? Is it a universality, or is it really about saying, if an object, if a place can define a cultural or a set of values systems, can we understand the implications of those value systems beyond the today, right? And I think that's a hard thing, but that's where we get back to the artist, because the artist is always engaged in turning the Rubik's Cube. You know, we think about preservation as something that is hard and fast, and that must exist as permanence, but there's preservation that exists in different forms as well. And so I think the artist has the capacity to be able to think in those kinds of terms and engage with the ephemeral sometimes. That is that sort of emotion that, you know, what does it feel like when the wind touches your face kind of description.
Sure. I think the ephemeral is a really good point. Like, it's not this permanence, right? Because that's the piece. It's like when you're creating these permanent monuments, right, that don't live and breathe, this is where they become overpowering, and people don't feel like they have access to them, right? So this whole element of like ephemerality is key, non-permanence, the ability to shift and move.
So in light of that, this will be my last question before I actually invite the rest of the audience to join the conversation, is in talking about historic preservation, I was especially excited to talk to both of you in light of our initiative, the Outsider Preservation Initiative, which is very much about those operating outside of historic preservation, those who are operating in the spirit of the outsider or in the, outsider artist, right? And in thinking about that, in the ways that you are describing historic preservation, it's not always the way we describe historic preservation in the classroom at all. And so in our work with outsider preservation, as we endeavor to identify these new practices or these grassroots practices or approaches to seeing people as artists and as preservationists, what are the sort of untold stories that you are seeing people bring to light who aren't necessarily in our classrooms, in our universities? What are those sort of untold stories and the practitioners that you see every day that maybe we don't know about?
Well, we spend a lot of time on oral histories. We are always recording people. Where I work, there is every number of people who come into that space, and it is evocative of something, whether it be because they've actually lived in that space, or it looks like something, or right. And so we spend a lot of time listening to stories that seem to that aren't about the great narratives over the world. But my favorite story, for instance, is a woman who, she's now 85. I met her when she was 60. And at 60, she told me the story of being the second saxophonist that sat on the stage at the Jefferson School, right? And she then came in at 70, and she told me a little bit more about that, right? How one particular moment, she made her dress as second section. So it's this cumulative narratives over time that add nuance to our sense of space and place. That, in my mind, the thing that connects us all is the possibility of hearing those same stories in our own lives and being able to put those stories in physical space so that it becomes experiential and amplified in those kinds of ways.
Not just one beginning at one time,
no,
one moment.
No.
And
no specific point of start and no specific point of end either.
Yeah.
Right. So sort of not moving out of the linear, but understanding the nuances within that linear. And I think that's an important piece of how we see the work now.
Yes.
So.
I'll go back to being personal once again. It's like preservationists. I live on my great-grandparents' property in Central Virginia. And right now I am beginning a preservation project where I am looking at my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents' church and preserving that. A church that was built in the 1800s, right? And so preserving that church with the last two members, which is my 82-year-old mother and the 94-year-old deacon. So those kind of like having conversations with them about what it means to keep this church alive. Yesterday they had service and they had like 6 people,
Yes.
in the congregation. But that was important for them to have that. And now I am the sexton of the church, so once a month I clean the church to get ready for service. And I'm thinking, this is my service, but this is also a form of preserving.
This is your preservation practice.
This is my preservation practice. And on the ground, making sure that these people are able to have service on the Sunday after I clean for like 6 hours on a Saturday and earn $50. But it is my service to how I'm going to preserve this, because there are developers looking to say, like, how much is that church? I want to buy that church. It's like, no, this church is not, you have no access to this.
Right.